Soundologia. Soundologia. Soundologia.
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the Soundologia podcast, episode number 2. Soundologia is where we have conversation about sound, arts, and technology. If you are interested in modern experimental music, various sound, unique sound experiments, and different approaches to sound perceptions, this is the place for you. I am your host, Pedja Kovačević, and I would like to welcome you to the Soundologia platform and our podcast series. If you have a passion for exploring and creating unusual sound forms and would like to be a part of the Soundologia project, please check our website, soundologia.com, where you can submit your work or idea, and we will get back to you about appearing on our show. Make sure to like the Soundologia page on Facebook and follow us on Instagram to stay up to date with our upcoming guests and events. In our first season, I will be hosting Miami-based artists, composers, performers, and those involved in sound, art, and technology. As Soundologia brings artists who explore the phenomena of sound from different perspectives, I'm privileged to have one of the most dedicated and most renowned sound artists, not only in Florida but across the United States. It's almost impossible to find someone who has such a long history of organizing experimental music festivals. We are talking about decades of work. He has brought to Miami some of the biggest names such as John Cage, Paulina Oliveros, Alvin Lucier, David Tudor, Morton Subotnick, Joseph Celli, John LaBarbera, James Tenney, George Lewis, Christian Wolff, Meredith Monk, and many, many more. He founded the Subtropics Festival in Miami and the Frozen Music Organization with his collaborators at the end of the 80s and has been the artistic director until today. For the last 30 years, Subtropics has built an international reputation among artists and audiences as one of the most creative, consistent, long-term projects and best-produced experimental music and sound art festivals. This year, Subtropics celebrates its 25th birthday, so I couldn't help but bring Gustavo Matamoros here at Soundologia to wish his festival a happy birthday. Good morning, Gustavo, and happy birthday to you and your Subtropics festivals. May there be at least 25 more fantastic and successful years to come. Hello, how are you?
Good. How are you, Pedja?
I'm doing well. Thank you for coming to be with us today.
I'm happy to be here.
Before we get started, Gustavo, I always like to ask our guests to give us a glimpse of their journeys. What brought you to experimental music and how did you get to where you are today?
Depending on how I answer that question, you could take the whole podcast, but I was born in Venezuela, and in Venezuela, people have to fight so many things. I will tell you one thing that may have played a role among so many. I remember my first class in primary school, first grade. The teacher pulls out a map of Venezuela and a stick and points at it and says, Venezuela is an underdeveloped country on its way towards development. And I had barely learned how to read. So that stuck with me. I mean, I can recite it right now verbatim. That's exactly the words she spoke. And I remember just, having this thing where you say, oh, well, so I guess our job is to develop, to move forward. So if you fast forward now to today, I guess my quest has, I came to the United States. I could have gone to Europe. I don't know what would have happened if I had gone there. But the idea of coming to the United States had to do with the fact that I always thought that the tradition of the United States was not so much one of the past, but one about forging a future. It's like about invention, and for me, it was so much about imagination, but more about discovery. Mm-hmm. And to me, the world sort of speaks to us through sound, and I have a natural tendency towards think somehow in sonic terms. I call it, this is the sound mind, the one that knows how to listen,
I think I can feel that Venezuelan spirit and the force that drives you make things better. When did you start experimenting with the sound? Was it in Venezuela or later when you came to the United States?
Well, early on, I had tools around the house. There was a piano, there was a guitar, there was radio. Well, actually, the one thing that I do remember very much is the shortwave radio. There was a shortwave radio home. And when friends would come to the house, my parents would want to entertain them. So I was too young. And so they would sit me right in front of the shortwave radio. And I would just basically, start working with the knobs. Mm-hmm. And, we started discovering that this thing, had sounds that were not necessarily the sounds I was expecting. And in trying to find stations or something or music. And there was these other sounds that kind of were probably in that context, it would be the mistakes. The incapacity of this radio to catch a radio signal caused these electronic sounding things to happen. And I would spend hours in front of that radio just simply trying to find new sounds.
Changing the frequency, right?
Yes. Just traveling through the radio dial and find, trying to, ever so slightly move it so that you could find something. And the sound of that thing, it was a console. It was a large console. I think it was a Philips radio. That I remember. And the sound of it from those speakers, it was very interesting. So there was that. And then, across the time, I taught myself how to play the guitar the way people tend to play the guitar. But also we just basically just play around with those instruments. And I found myself going inside the piano and everything like that with kitchen stuff. And when I first came to the United States, I actually didn't come to a music school. I went to a liberal arts school in mid-New York State. People say, well, it's in the middle of nowhere, but it's in the middle of New York State. It's called Elmira. It was Elmira College. And one time, I went to a concert there that was advertised as being by the New England New Music Ensemble. And I told myself when I read the thing, I said, well, if he's got the word new twice in the title, I got to go. It's got to be good, So I went there, and in fact, this was a very impressive experience. Mostly you have chamber performers, chamber musicians with tuxedos, but tremendously long hairs and long beards, right? And they're performing, contemporary music, chamber music. But there was a couple of pieces that really blew my mind, especially one called In the Bag. And In the Bag was basically a bag that would walk into the stage, for people would bring the bag into the stage. There was a light on it, and attached to it, there was, I guess microphones, 4 microphones and 4 speakers. And all of a sudden, there's this thing on the stage, and a lot of time goes by and nothing is happening. And then, all of a sudden there's a little noise and a little noise. And then as you hear more noise, you can tell that the bag is moving. And then, it's like the size of a mattress. 3 minutes later, this bag is jumping up and down the stage, and the sound of that bag is incredibly, it's just, overwhelming. And finally, the piece ends with somebody breaks out of the bag and the light goes off. You barely see him, and everything goes quiet immediately. And I said to myself, I keep talking to myself after this experience. I said, wow, if this is music, I want to be a composer, right? So that actually gave me another push to seek, going to study music. But before then, I wasn't too sure that music was what I wanted to. While I was there, I was actually learning radio production, and I was working a lot with tape and doing a lot of, editing, splicing tape and stuff like that. And when I was maybe around 12 or 13, I discovered when there was music coming out from, rock people that was closer to me. I was listening to a band like Egg they had music which was actually very intricate, and I was immediately became interested in all these meter changes and things like that, which I didn't understand. But they would have chunks of electronic sounds in it that were like really kind of free, and so I became, that drew my attention, and so I bought all the records. And then it to me, it was kind of like a very nice way of discovering that the recording studio could be an instrument. I, of course, didn't understand any of these things the way I'm explaining them now. I just simply was doing these things intuitively. And at some point, my intuition said, well, you're studying, you just graduated from high school, you started university, you're studying computers because you think that may be a good idea. But what about this thing that you're trying to kind of pursue, this kind of like this very magnetic attraction to sound? Maybe you want to study music. That's what I told myself. And so I started, taking the steps to see if I could organize a way to get into school. And I was able to do that. And I ended up at the University of Miami after several other places.
It's great that you mentioned the band Egg as one of your favorite bands that influenced your music style before you became a composer. Just for our listeners, it's about the music band associated with a British rock scene during the 70s, amazing band with a great song, Enneagram, that I cannot play now, but you can find on YouTube. It was one experiment for that time, I would say, with lots of inventions in terms of rock music, experimenting with keyboards, constant change of tonality, a lot of phrases playing with the different instruments. So very, very avant-garde for that time. But let me ask you the question regarding your studies at University of Miami. What was the program in composition and theory of music like back then when you enrolled the University of Miami and the Frost School of Music? And let us know something about the evolution of the Miami experimental music scene.
Well, I mean, it was basic. For instance, we've been talking about electronic music. The electronic music studio was mostly analog instruments. There were, a couple of good stuff. There was a nice reel-to-reel tape recorder, mixing board, etc., etc. And there was even a small computer that at the time was really basic. And it was used to teach a class called the hybrid, digital analog hybrid class. But other than that, there wasn't. I think there was a couple microphones and things like that. So it was, from my perspective, it was a place for, creating electronic music and tape music, basically.
I suppose you had a chance to work with some famous musicians, or to hear someone who came down from the north of those famous experimentalists at that time.
Well, actually, while I was still in school, some of the people that you mentioned actually came down to the school, because at the time, parallel to me being there in Miami, I arrived to Miami in 1979, and already 79, 80, there was a lady here in Miami. Her name is Mary Loft. And Mary Loft started an organization called Tiger Tail Productions. And at the time, she started a series of new music. She called it a Meet the Composer series, which was actually, it began because at the time, the organization Meet the Composer, which now evolved into what's called now New Music USA. I'm on an advisory committee for that organization at the moment. But before, it was called Meet the Composer, and they had a program of funding that would give, a certain amount of dollars, maybe up to $1,000, to if you committed to presenting a composer and bringing the composer to a presentation. So what she did that was really clever was, well, why not bring composers who play their own music? And so, and of course, before she came to Miami, or she was involved with organizing a New Music America festival. I mean, I think New Music America started around then, like 79 or something like that. So she could have been involved with the people that started that. Anyway, at the time, she was bringing people down, and one of the people she brought was Alvin Lucier. So he came to my school because as part of their, they would give a concert, and then they would come to the school to give some kind of a presentation to the students. So I met Alvin then. We brought John Cage in, the school did, in 1983. So I met him then for the first time. And before that, Pauline Oliveros had come to play a concert for Mary Loft as well, and several other people. And then there was a time when there's an artist by the name of Russell Freling, who's the first sound artist that I know, born in Miami Beach. When Mary took a leave of absence because she got one of those traveling grants, she was supposed to be out for about a year. So Russell took over the series, and he was friends with all these people too. So we're talking about Robert Ashley came, David Berman, David Tudor, while I was just basically coming out of school, and then a couple of years before we ourselves started thinking about organizing festival. The idea for an organization was at the University of Miami with some of the people who were still, graduate students and students there.
Gustavo, just to let our listeners know, we are talking about the mid and late 80s.
Yeah, now we're moving to late 80s. And so at first was just basically like a couple concerts from the University of Miami. Someone there was organizing 2 concerts a year of basically people from the university at the main library downtown. So it was an effort to try to get the music out of the university and to the community to have that experience. And then at some point, his name was Joseph Koikar. And then Joseph Koikar graduated and he was going to leave. And then Orlando Garcia basically, said, sure, maybe I'll keep that ball rolling. But, it would be nice to start an organization. So a bunch of people got together. That evolved into what became the South Florida Composers Alliance. At that moment, everybody was volunteer and all that. And that Composers Alliance is it had a mission, but I think its main purpose for most of the people that were involved was to help them trampoline into a career in music, particularly a teaching position at a university. So as those, as the organization started, maybe it took about a year and a half for that group to almost disintegrate because people who started to get jobs, or some actually gave up on music, unfortunately. It's a natural Darwinian, I guess, thing. But anyway, so there was 4 of us basically that remained. And of those 4, 3 of them were people who wanted to continue pursuing this. They already had jobs. Orlando already had been hired at FIU, and a couple of the other people took on jobs away and all that. And so at some point, we realized that the organization was kind of like about to die. At the same time, I was working for the New Music America Festival, and Joseph Celli was in town, and I had been working with him for a couple years and doing different things. And with him, we wrote, I said, well, let's write some grants because I want to start a festival. And so we wrote some state grants, and he helped me do that. We wrote 3 grants, and we got a salary assistance grant and a festival grant, and then a general operational grant. And with that, we were able to establish a position in the organization. And because the other people were not really interested in working for the organization, given that they had interest in other kinds of jobs, I was the only one left. And I also felt like, wow, this is kind of like a blessing, because in a way, now here's an infrastructure that can be utilized to experiment with the notion of what it means to be a composer in the community, which are ideas that were planted already from the university when these people came over, and show me their work and all this, and realizing that there were not university composers, there were community composers. And somehow there was a life outside of the university that didn't depend on you teaching. Mm-hmm. And I didn't feel like I was necessarily that good. Well, I mean, I think I can teach fine, but it's not my calling. It's like, my calling is more, the experiments and the thing. And then, so starting the festival was my idea, and I got the funding for it, and so everybody came together, and it slowly, it began to emerge from that seed, this festival thing that now is becoming 25 this coming September. In 2009, we stopped doing it every year, and we started jumping. Well, 2007, we started jumping. Made it a biennial. That's why it's been about 30 some years now, but it's only 25. 25 festival.
We will speak about that a little bit later. Tell me, you mentioned grants, fundings. Was it more challenging to get project funded earlier, that time when you started the festival, or later, or comparing to this time?
Well, raising funds has always been hard in the arts in general. I think that our budgets are never really adequate for the amount of organizations and artists who seek funding. So you always have to figure out some kind of way to describe what you're doing in the best light possible. And so speaking about experimental music, it's always a challenge because, you have to add to the fact that things are hard already, the reality that not many people at least at the beginning, understood what that meant. However, I found it earlier to convince people to the value of experimental music and sound art and all of these new ideas. Now I feel like things have gotten to the point where it's just becoming too sterile. Things are now so defined in such narrow ways, and the expectations are, a value changes, where people place value. Unfortunately, I think that is a change that is not necessarily a change good for the art. It's a change that makes things a little bit more expedient, right? There's a lot of administrative, stuff that apparently is working much nicer and very well oiled things happening. But I think the outcome of it is not as interesting as it used to be. I remember right now, one of the major funding sources in Miami is the Knight Foundation. And the Knight Foundation has become, compared to what it used to be, a tremendous resource for artists, supportive organization, and in a way that's actually a little bit more democratic and all that. But because in the past, it was kind of like a very obscure thing. It's like if you were not the opera or the museums or, some big institution, you would have a hard time even bothering filling out a proposal, because you knew that there was so many obstacles between you, a small organization, and their ears. They didn't have open ears. Now they have tremendously open ears. So I'm really happy that's the way it is.
Absolutely, no doubt about it, that getting project funded, getting a grant became super challenging, especially for small artist organizations. But let's get back to the festival. Can you take us through the time and point out some of the most memorable years in the events during the festival? I know it's impossible to go into details in the short time we have, but give us a brief retrospective of all festival years behind us so we can get sense of its content and importance. And maybe you can mention just some specific events that you memorized.
Of course, my best memories of the festival are interactions. When you help somebody who performs their own work in setting up a concert experience for people, and then you witness what happens in that experience. If you pay attention to the way you organize this as an experience, which is one of the things that I think conceptually the festival is about, is how do you present this music so that people who don't know anything about it come in, have an experience, and then leave and say, I don't know what happened here, but I was impressed, or something happened. Okay? That makes me happy. So from that perspective, I could say, well, of course, John Cage came here in 1991. He was here for 3 days. He stayed in my house. Well, he was around the whole time. So a lot of people he was accessible. And we did do a couple of events, but mostly concerts of his music. And the last one was he himself performing an excerpt of Empty Words, Part 4. And of course, after that, he spoke with everybody. I have collected some anecdotes. I have an anecdote by Orlando and by John van der Sluis, who are, John van der Sluis was my teacher at school, and a few other people about their interactions with John Cage. Also, not from the time he came here, but also from the time he came to the University of Miami. That was an impressive experience.
What was spending time with John Cage like? And can you share any funny story with us from that time?
Yes, I remember many. We recorded an interview, actually, he and I, because at the time I was making these pieces called Portraits, and or beginning to. And so I had done, I think I had done maybe 2 by then. And the 2 were one for Joseph Celli, which was the first one, I think. And the second one I did for this poet in town. His name was Bob Gregory. Probably, to me, in my book, the best poet I have ever known, because he was all about sound. So I asked Cage if he would mind, maybe we do an interview and maybe I'll do a portrait. And so we did this interview, and then later on I started a radio project. It wasn't a radio show, but it was a radio project. I wanted to produce a series that could be at some point just played on the radio, pre-produced and played on the radio. So it was called Fish Tank, and so I started producing from these interviews that I originally recorded for the portraits. I started producing some little pieces, from those interviews, and I did end up doing a portrait for John Cage a year after he died. that was done in Venezuela. Actually, is for string orchestra and tape, and that was premiered there. The year after, George Lewis came over for a week residency, and we spent a lot of time together. Again, the same thing, trying to figure out. He did a lot of collaborative things, so we try to organize a few musicians to work with him, etc., etc. He was playing the trombone at the time, and his major piece was the Voyager piece, and so we featured that. And then Alvin Lucier, we did a mini retrospective of his works. He was here for a week too, and there's some, he did a performance of music for solo performer, and in the same gallery we had an exhibition of his sound on paper, and he played a concert of piano music twice in the same evening that included, several of his piano pieces. He played them himself, including the one with the teapot, the arrangement of Strawberry Fields. What is it called? Nothing is Real, I think is called the piece. And then, and he made a new installation that we presented at the museum, Miami Art Museum, for piano and car alarm system. That was an interesting piece. And then David Tudor came that year too, and so these were all about David. I have nice memories, even though we didn't spend as much time together. But he came because Russell was also involved, so, he committed to picking him up at the airport. And on the way he says, well, I need like 6 hours to set up. And so, okay, great. So we were there in the morning, and he wanted to stop at the liquor store on the way there and so on. So, it was a tremendous production with David. I mean, these are what I remember most about this is the people and their quality, the kind of human being these people are. I think that really my motivation for doing this is this. I think of these people as my family, even though some of them were not that close. We're not that close, perhaps because of geography. But, every time we come together, the conversations are of a kind where we feel connected deeply. And this connection, which has to do with the notion of what experimental music is and all this, really reveals that, sort of like a way of being that doesn't require so much regulations and things like that. That if people just simply behave in an adult manner and concentrated on things that, could be the things that people really are looking for. So the work that I do is so much informs the way I live. In other words, it's one and the same thing. It's like I do experiments in sound in order to learn how to live. And so I embrace them in my life in order to understand what's the next thing that I need to experiment on, that kind of thing.
Interesting philosophy. I like it. Gustavo, let us know something about the reception, and if you compare the audience at that time with the people that attend the concert now, what can you say?
We had larger audiences there then, and very diverse as well, because the people came out of curiosity. And not only that, but there was, again, I spoke about Mary Love. She had a very cohesive series that presented it. There was new music on the radio also. Steve Malagodi, the premier producer of radio at WLRN, whose interest in new music and experimental music it's been there since I got here. When I first got here, one of the first things that happened was I discovered his show was called New Music Miami, Monday nights from 10 to midnight. Mm-hmm. And New Music Miami was basically a showcase of the most, the latest in new music. it was mostly published music that was distributed by this organization in New York called the New Music Distribution Service.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was his source of material. And a lot of people would send him, of course, promotional copies of things. So, he was able to keep that program going for at least 10 years, I recall.
Mm-hmm.
And then he faced a little bit of a difficult time at the station because, NPR was changing nationally, and he was actually imposing on local stations some, programming, and that emptied out some of the local programs, and his program happened to be one of those. So during the week, he loses his spot during the week, and then that was around the time when the New Music Distribution Service also went under or stopped operating, and so he switched to a show called the Modern School of Modern Jazz. And was a show that mostly featured, modern jazz and free improvisation and, and a lot of ornette common. Very, very wonderful show. We also need to think about the artists as an audience. How so? Well, art is not something, you may be born with the itch, but that doesn't mean that you're born already knowing everything. And if you did, there's no reason to practice. There's no reason to make art. So what I mean is that there's an audience that is very important to the festival, given that experimental music is not about a finished product. If we think about experimentalism on the basis of, say, research and development, which is an idea that most people have a relationship with. So research is about, testing things, doing a lot of testing and trying out things, right? And sometimes discovering things that are tremendously good and important in some kind of future, but not until the development people develop product for people to consume that people begin to have an experience of it. So it's with the experience that people learn to consume. It's not before. So what happens if we insert, a certain kind of audience in between the research and the development in order to conduct the studies and so on of how is it that this music is going to be a music of the future, or what is it valuable about for society, or these things. I mean, the most likely audience to get something out of this and digest it in ways that could be then maybe turned into some kind of product for later people to consume would be people who are already interested in music and in art and that are open to new ideas. And then they could, I don't know what the new ideas necessarily are, and I'm not necessarily getting behind any particular one idea, but I can recognize somebody that's working on something really interesting and I want to present that. Why? Because that may become the inspiration for someone else to do something that then becomes the other thing. So I think that, when you are engaged in some kind of research, you need an audience that is open to discovering, the benefits of things. And you also need what I call accomplices, people that are going to push you or encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. Maybe you don't have something quite yet, but you know what? Keep at it, man. You're in the right way. You're doing the. So that kind of infrastructure is what the Subtropics Festival is trying to organize in terms of its community design. Some kind of appreciation for the notion that in art, we also have research, and that research can be accessible to an audience, right? But maybe it shouldn't be compared to whatever people are doing in order to win awards and, like Oscars and things like that. Nah, that's not the point. The point here is not to win awards. The point here is to discover things that are important to society, that can help, kind of get society to their next level of functionality and structural cohesiveness.
What was the most challenging time you experienced regarding the festival organization, your work over 3 decades?
The most difficult thing I encountered during the festival was working with a couple of people whose personalities were so difficult, right? And that showed me these people are not really part of this community, of the Subtropics community. And I remember saying to myself, from now on, I mean, it happened really once around, again, 1994. And I say, after doing that once, I say, well, from now on, Subtropics is going to be the nice people's festival.
I understand, absolutely, yeah. Putting a lot of efforts and enthusiasm in something that is not so popular and lucrative, and it should be really appreciated.
Yeah. You know what? I'm ignoring all this because I'm not really in academia. I don't have to pay attention to it that way. In other words, I can afford to do what I'm doing in the context that I'm doing it. Mm-hmm. That's part of the experimentation that I'm trying to see whether this is actually something. Mm-hmm. And that if I keep true to this thing, will it really survive and continue and this and that? And people will appreciate it. And, so far I feel validated.
How important is it for Miami to have a festival like this held here for years or decades at different locations at the Soundscape Park in Miami Beach and the beautiful Deering Estate in Palmetto Bay?
Yeah.
Do you have a diverse audience regarding, for example, these two sites and different parts of the city that are in different areas? And how was it earlier?
Well, the history of the festival is marked by the opportunities there are in order to organize in a sane way, right? Infrastructure to be able to do it. So, through the years, that has changed. So it used to be that at the beginning we had the library, then we started, experimenting with presenting things at different places. Manuel Artime Theater, we would rent spaces, but mostly I'm talking about places that would just let us use the space or would host some event of the festival. So we've done it at churches. We've done it in so many different places. There's someone right now, his name is Juraj Kovačević, who is really amazing in organizing his events in so many different places. He's constantly making this. I used to be able to do that, but not as easy anymore for me. So I guess I'm getting older, and I need things. I'm no longer rock and roll. So like hauling equipment, from here to there is getting harder. But I focus more on the actual content of the thing, and what the thing is likely to be able to transmit. The experience of sound in a space. That is at the core of the festival. I couldn't do it online, for instance. Mm-hmm. I cannot imagine doing that online, even though I have seen, for instance, Mills College did a concert recently, 2-3 months ago. John Bishop had a performance, and the concert sounded beautiful in the headphones. Mm-hmm. And so, but there's a lot of production value attached to that live performance that allows for it to be a pleasant experience online. But I don't have those resources. And still, I think that, basically the idea of the festival, the real value of the festival is that live interaction with sound. So I am grateful that the county allowed me and the city of Miami Beach allowed me to roll over funding from last year to be able to do it this year and those kinds of things. And so we just keep it could kind of like problem solving kind of a way, which has a lot to do with improvisation, and it's got a lot to do with experience.
Right. The improvisation and the experience are the fundamental parts of the experimental arts. And you also mentioned Irai Koish, one of the leading Miami-based artists, who is experimenting with his Feta Foundation and who will appear on my Soundologia show soon. Anyway, let's move on to the festival and celebration of 25th Subtropics. Let's present some of the artists who are coming. There are a lot of names. The website is very informative, and it's happening this week from September 16th to September 19th at 2 locations in Miami, Florida. So who is coming, Gustavo?
My first idea was to actually bring the pioneering artists who are still alive before they leave us. Understanding that, like someone like Malcolm Goldstein, who's a veteran, it's almost like saying, well, we're bringing Pauline Oliveros. Well, Malcolm Goldstein, who is not going to be coming because his health is not so good and the pandemic here has got him afraid. So that one I understand. But the idea was, let's make part of the festival be about the presence of the thing in it. In other words, these people are the sources of some of this knowledge. These are the people who first started to, come up with these ideas. And when an idea comes to you, usually it's because there's tremendous need, right? It reveals something that you're really kind of trying to figure out, and these people have consistently been that in the context of experimental music. So I think that's at the core of experimental music. It's the attitude towards making music, it's an attitude. So I want people to have access to the people and their personalities and the quality of the person, etc., so that they can better understand at least where the music comes from. And so when they listen, also they might listen with an enhanced attitude, more respect for the music. Most people that you hear talking about this, like, oh yeah, you mean like the ping, boom, bang, ping, bang, and yeah, that's what I mean, but not quite that way. So right now the list includes people that are coming to perform. Jin Hee Kim is a Korean komongo player. She plays the electric komongo. Joseph Shelley is coming. He is the main performer in one of Phil Niblock's pieces that I like to feature during the festival. Mm-hmm. It's called 2 Octaves and a Fifth. It was written for Joseph Shelley and performed on the oboe. And, these pieces are characterized by tremendous rigor in performance, mm-hmm. Playing these tones very much in tune with certain specific tunings. There's Avi Rader, says free jazz. He's actually from this area. I'm always very happy to be able to present him. He's just incredible drummer, and he has really good musicians. The trio is fantastic. John McMinn on the saxophone and Kyle Mottle on the double bass, who is also, aside from being a an improviser, he's also a very good, double bass player. He's going to be playing music by some contemporary composers who have written pieces for him during the festival. Other performers include some local, performers, but we're talking about the visiting ones. LaDonna Smith is a free improviser on the viola. Mm-hmm. She comes from Birmingham. Margaret Len Tang, she is a pianist. She's an expert on the music of John Cage. And when we met, she was down here playing a piece by Morton Feldman related to a show that the museum was doing it was an exhibition of Jasper Jones. So it turns out that for the past 25 years, she's been doing pieces with the toy piano. So she's going to come and do some of those pieces. The question of Tom Bogner, who's a baritone, who's planning, the plan is for him to come to do a piece by Alvin Lucier and a piece by Robert Ashley. Christoph Cox he wrote a book that came out last year called Sonic Flux. So he's going to give a talk about that. We also have Suzanne de la Hante, happens to live in Miami since 1995. She, in her earlier career, in the 70s, she was one of the first people to curate a sound show. It was called Soundings. And there's a book about it, and she's going to talk about that show and her essay. And then we have fabulous Kenny Goldsmith. Kenny Goldsmith is just one of my favorite friends, artists. We met back in 1993 when he came down. We put together as a branch of Subtropics a festival that focused only on language-based art. So it was a festival of concrete poetry and sound poetry, radio art, all these different language-based art forms. We're going to include some of those this year, but he's making a piece exclusively for the festival. It's a 40-minute piece. He calls it a talk poem. And he's a very important person in my life and in the festival. He himself has told me that the festival had an impact on his own work. So, and then the other person that I would love to mention is Pat Olesko. Pat Olesko is really a performance artist. She does many things. She does her performances, but she also makes films and all that. But the way that I see her connection with the festival is that she's extremely interested in language and particularly in puns. And I think that puns are just the perfect ground for experimentation with language and sound and so on. And meaning, that's, I think, it reflects kind of the qualities that I speak of the sound mind. The sound mind being that one that understands things from the sound perspective without having to translate it into visual.
You can find more information about the festival and all artists who are coming on the subtropics.org. That's the website, and the link is also posted in the description of this episode. Gustavo decided to make some of our listeners happy today, so he brought some tickets for the upcoming festival. Check our Instagram profile for more information and how to get tickets for some of the upcoming shows. It's also important to say that the festival will pay tribute to some of the big names in the experimental art world. And friends of Subtropic Festival, such as Sam Ashley, Carl Santos, John Cage, Paulina Oliveros, Bob Gregory. The festival will get the support from local Miami-based artists. Let's mention just Frank Falestra.
Frank Falestra is the force behind the International Noise Festival. And so it's a different kind of festival, but we really, for years, we've been appreciating each other's, contributions to the community. So he's a really amazing person. There's also Kyle Mottle. There's some artists coming from Tampa this time. David Manson is also a great trombonist, both improvisational and as well as a composer. He's a very good composer, and he's got a quartet. So and the members of his quartet are mostly jazz musicians. And then there's this composer. His name is Tom Kersey, who's a cello player as well. So I'm excited. I never really heard him perform before. So I'm excited to. This is also something that I get excited about, is to be able to have an experience I haven't had before. Another person that I should mention is Jose Ignacio Hernandez Sanchez. He's a tremendously creative artist who happens to live in Miami. A lot of these people just happen to live in Miami. So, and the other thing that I should say is many of the people that we are featuring in the festival, some of them are not coming. They were not able to come. But every one of those people, I have made sure that there's something in the festival that represents their work. And that's how the retrospective comes together. Some of the people that I mentioned also have been, members of our National Advisory Board for years. People like Gregory Whitehead, who's a radio artist, George Lewis, Alvin Lucier, Chris Mann, Trempen. We've had so many people be part of that. And I just collect them. I just put them on the advisory board, and what that does is gives me the excuse to call them up and ask them questions about what they think about this or that.
It sounds like a good strategy to get people work for you. Anyway, we came to the end of the first part of today's show. You have been listening to the conversation I have with Miami-based composer, sound designer, and founder of Subtropics Festival and Frozen Music Ensemble. Gustavo Matamoros is with us today. And I think he took us on the journey through the history of the evolution of the Miami experimental music scene and the evolution of the festival. We also presented artists who are going to perform at the 25th Subtropics. So in the next segment, we are going to feature Gustavo's music, Gustavo's work, and his sound installations. So let's play some sound. It was the first of 3 compositions that we are going to listen today. Small Sounds is the part of a bigger collection, a bigger series. You said that small sounds are the result of various sounding strategies you apply to recordings, the sound and objects. So explain me those strategies.
Well, the notion of small sounds, it comes from the idea that everything in the world has a sound to go with it, right? In other words, now what that means is that in an object, there's always the potential for sound. And that object, in other words, we can manipulate it, we can activate it in some kind of way. And we would do that in order to explore its sonic possibilities, its acoustical properties. So I'm just fascinated with small things. And it was because, again, my friend Russell Freling, the sound artist from Miami, in the 80s, before I was just getting into this idea of working with sound this way. And he gave me a cartridge, a phono cartridge that he himself had gotten from David Tudor. So, because Russell actually toured Rainforest with the crew from the Composers in Electronics and David Tudor and all those people. So one or twice or something like that, he was a member of that crew. And so he and David Tudor had a close relationship. And I think David Tudor had gone to Japan and found some kind of a supplier for these phono cartridges, and he bought a whole bunch. So he brought them to the United States. So he gave a few to his close friends, and Russell happened to be one of them. So I got one from him and started experimenting with it. But the thing is, that particular transducer was just an entry into the, of course, I was familiar with piezoelectric elements, the ceramic discs that are utilized to do like contact miking and this and that, right? But the nice thing about the cartridge is that you can thread things into it. And I think that's basically the basis for cartridge music, the piece by John Cage. And that's what David Tudor used to use it for. Mm-hmm. But I think after that piece, David kept using the cartridges in order to explore different sounds and create content for his source tapes that he called. And I sort of understood that as a way of studying sound. So I started looking at different small objects and things like that, and just trying to figure out how to amplify them. And the idea was to amplify loud enough to kind of get a sense of what's inside those objects. It's almost like this. It's the same idea of cartridge music if you just use the cartridge, but if you have other amplifying means, then you're doing the same thing. And I think sometimes with Cage, you had this tendency of him naming pieces, like guitar piece, it's a lot of guitar pieces by a lot of composers, but there's only one cartridge music, and that's by Cage.
Exactly.
But the name is the name of an instrument rather than the name of a piece. It's also the name of a piece, but but what I do with the instrument is not necessarily what Cage wrote in his score to do. So, and then then I met David Dunn, who's, aside from being a composer, he's a bioacoustician, and he has several designs for transducers. He invented a transducer to be able to record bark beetles inside the tree. So it's basically a device. What he did was he took a meat thermometer and gathered it, and then he rigged it with a piezoelectric element, and then attached it to a cable and hooked it up to an amplifier. And this thing is amazing at capturing the sound of bark beetles in the trees. And as a matter of fact, scientists that study the bark beetles, especially because of the problem up in the Rocky Mountains right now, there's an invasion of bark beetles. They had never heard the sounds that David was recording. He put out a CD with the sounds, and the scientists were listening to this, and he said, "We never heard these sounds before." And he said, and so they started asking him what kind of microphone he's using, and he started making microphones for the scientists to use. And then, quickly, he started collaborating with them. And one thing that they found out was that the beetles didn't make those sounds in the lab. They only made them out in the wild, in the actual trees. So meaning that the bark beetles have a tremendously complex, sound plays a complex role in their sociological interaction. And so David, based on that, came up with an idea for a device that would maybe help mitigate that. He has a patent for this device in collaboration with the university. And the thing is very effective. It's basically, it drives these insects out of the tree. They go crazy. They go crazy and leave the tree. So those are small sounds too. So I said, I found a king, soul here working with small sounds, the bark beetle sounds. And he has recordings of bark beetles and of ants in their nests. And they're really gorgeous, amazing recordings. So I would consider those to be small sounds too, except, I didn't record those. David recorded them. And so small sounds really an exploration of a world that needs some kind of a microscope, auditorily speaking, that will allow you to examine the sound characteristics of a particular thing that's small. And so what I do is I collect in my studio, like an artist in the studio. They put together materials and then they make paintings with those materials and things like that, or whatever, by putting together little pieces. I do that. I collect different sounds, different things, do different gestures, try different ways of extracting sound from different things. And then I make pieces with those sounds, and I call those small sounds pieces.
Nice. And I love that comparison that you just mentioned between microscope and a transducer. Actually, just for our listeners, Gustavo used different transducers to capture these small sounds, how it calls sound transducers. That's practically a device that is the converter that convert a sound signal into electronical signal, or electronical signal into sound signal, so or vice versa.
Yeah.
And that's a great experiment, really. You're the expert in field recordings and capturing sound from nature. You recorded so many animals and the sounds. You mentioned Everglades.
Yeah, in Miami.
That is the part of zoomusicology that deals with analyzing different animals and sounds that they produce. How do you compare capturing the sound using transducer and being in the nature and using a field recorder?
Well, the main difference is that in the transduction, let's call it contact miking to be more, general in the term. What is happening is that the vibration of a medium or of a thing is being transferred directly to the pickup. So in that process, there is no space. There is no sense of acoustics of a surrounding space, for example. So the sound that you capture is a sound that's devoid of something. It's like the way we hear ourselves when we put our fingers in our ears. We don't sound anything like what we think we sound when we... Why? Because when we speak into a room, we hear ourselves, but we also hear the room, the space.
Yeah, because of the resonance.
Right, exactly. The way that sound bounces around. So what do we actually hear when we hear a sound? We hear three things normally, except if we're hearing from a transducer, we hear content, which is the information that represents an event. Something happens, it makes a sound, we hear it, right? And not only do we hear it, but what we hear is the shape of that event, the chronology of the event, the history of it, the trajectory of it, all of the things that we are required to perceive in order to understand what happened. The other thing that we hear is the personality, the acoustic personality of the source, of the thing that produces the sound. So, for instance, I have a certain tone of voice, and when you hear me, you can pick me out from a crowd just by hearing my voice, which it could be different than yours, and for many reasons. It's not just simply the acoustics of the voice, which is mostly what I'm speaking about, like the tone quality. But there's also other characteristics, the way that you pronounce things or something like that. That is part of your sound signature. And the other thing that we hear in the same sound when sound from the air hits our ear is how the space impacts that event, that sound. The space has a way of imposing its own personality on the sounds that you hear that happens within that space. Now we're talking about architecture. So, I'm speaking to you from my dining room table. The sound is bouncing off of the table to the microphone, but you also hear how the sound is bouncing around this room. And this microphone is not capable of hearing all those details because it's designed to only hear what's really close. But if I had a different microphone, you'll be able to hear so many other things, right? So that's basically the third thing. And all those things kind of become one.
Yeah.
And that's what makes your ear vibrate. And our brain is capable of decoding all of that information from that one vibration. And the brain is able to make sense of it somehow. That's marvelous. That's incredible, right? That things kind of merge into one thing and then you can separate. It's like having a 24-channel mix that, I'm going to send it to you mono, and then when you get there, you're going to separate it into 24 again, right? And how does that happen? It's incredible, right? So the brain is capable of doing that. So what we're doing when we are contact miking something is we are taking away the third element, which is the space. And so the difference then becomes the air microphone listens to air molecules. And so in order for the microphone to be able to capture something, air molecules have to push each other. And that happens when we actually speak out loud in the air and all that. So that's the main difference. So the sounds in the Everglades, they're all happening through air before they get to the mic. and I'm not able to. But if I wanted to record the bark beetles, I would have to walk up to a tree, insert the microphone in there, the transducer, right? And by the way, now that I think about it, there's a chamber inside the transducer. I mean, that thermometer is hollow. It's not a nail. It's a hollow thing, right? And when you introduce it into this hole inside the tree, there's a cavity where the actual bark beetle is, invading. He makes a cavity, and that cavity has an acoustical thing inside. So I mean, this idea of architecture is hard to escape, Like architecture in the mouth, I mean, part of your sound signature has to do with the mouth being a hole, and the vocal cords, put out sound, and your mouth can shape that sound. And that the shaping of a vowel is architecture. Whoa, imposing itself over that sound.
Exactly.
So if you were to ask me what's the difference between music and sound art, I would say, well, sound artists tend to talk the way I'm talking now. I'm trying to speak this way, not to be condescending or anything, but because my experience in doing the festival is that a lot of people don't really know what's happening. They're really simple concepts. There's no reason to bring in like really complicated words. But the people who understand those words get something out of it. The other ones, different. So I always think I'm speaking to someone that doesn't really understand.
And this actually brings us closer to the deep listening concept that is a training and a skill to listen to music. In that terms, we are speaking about your second piece you chose for this conversation, and it's my favorite. The name of the composition is 85 Audible Moments. Those are small sounds that you found and collected and prepared for one ceremony.
Yes.
The piece supposed to be one of 85 compositions performed at Paulina Oliveira's 85th birthday event. The composition was commissioned by Ione Luis, Paulina's spouse. But unfortunately, the event was cancelled. It didn't happen because Paulina passed away before it. So let me first ask you to recall the memory from that time and your feelings being one of the composers to compose for that purpose.
Oh, well, first of all, yes, we, when the project got started, it was supposed to be a secret, right? Because, Ione wanted to set it up as a surprise for Pauline. So Pauline had no idea this was going on. The fact is that the event in the end did happen. It's just that she wasn't there. She died before the event happened, unfortunately for everybody. But, well, actually, I remember that when I got the message, if I wanted to be one of these composers, I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know what to do. But it turns out that I've been working this way for many years, and especially I started doing these. I call them sound melodies. And the reason why I call them sound melodies is because these are sequences of sound events. A melody is made up of single tones that are, often different from one another. Each of these tones usually, will have a certain rhythmic or duration, right? And the duration, so a melody is just something that you can sing or whistle. Something like that would be a melody.
I found the score of the piece, and there are practically, just to explain shortly, there are 85 sounds from the various gadgets, machines, toys, some music instruments, bird song, radio stations.
So I tend to just string those together. I started doing that in the portraits based on sounds that I would collect from the actual interviews. So I would deconstruct the speech and extract different timbres from that speech. I honestly, at first, didn't think of those as pieces. I thought of them as the accompaniment to the performance by the people that I was making the portraits for. So they, I would make this tape part and they would play over it, and that would be the piece. And then it came to a point where I started actually gating the tape part because, I was unhappy with the idea of people, of the score dictating, or the tape dictating what was happening. I wanted the performer to have more control over the tape, and because I'm more rock and roll than computer scientist, I decided that gates were really a nice way to do that. So the way, even though those are kind of like on switches of sort, they respond to intensities and things like that. But they do so organically, depending on how you set them. Then I thought that the complexity of the piece could come from the content inside the tape. And the surprise that when the musician would play, then all of a sudden a sound would come out and they had to deal with that musically. Now the piece has that in it. And, and you're performing with it, and then you have to kind of figure out how to negotiate that. So the pieces became more improvisational. I was experimenting with all these things, but what I was really happy about was the fact that whenever the performer stopped, the composition ended. If the person ran out of ideas, that's when the piece ended, So I created many pieces using that technique. And then after I, stopped making those pieces, I realized that these tape parts that I was using were actually pretty nice as musical events themselves. So I started actually using them. At first, just those pieces, I would just, distribute them to people for playing like acoustically in a concert or something like that. Or as part of a soundtrack for a film, which I did a couple of those. And then came this idea that, sometimes just as a compositional strategy to follow that process. And it's a process of basically randomness. What I like about this idea is that when you record a sound, right? Any sound, you're recording an event, right? And that event could be a long event, a short event, or whatever. When you start dissecting these events, right? And depending on what criteria you're using for doing that, you can redefine what an audible is. And what I call an audible is a segment of a recorded sound. A segment of a recorded sound that I think of as a unit of meaning in sound. So I don't think of it in terms of language, but I use language as a way to describe the process I go through in order to identify an audible. So to me, what feels like a word in sound, I would call an audible. So it's a complete, it's some complete audible thing that makes sense, right? That's how I think about the audible.
When I ask you to name 2 books or music articles important for your philosophy and musical creation, you said an English dictionary.
Yeah.
And you said even you're not a linguist, you use it as a tool to experiment sound design.
Yeah.
You call these audibles segments of recorded audio representing a complete sound gesture, occurrence, or event. Tell me more about it.
Okay, so what is a complete thing? So, for instance, then one name worth bringing up is this name, Bob Gregory. He's a sound poet from early years. The second sound portrait I did for him, and his poetry was very much constructed. The way that he wrote poetry was by collecting sentences and things that he loved. He just, that he responded to. And he would just basically write that particular segment of the thing that he found that spoke to him. and leave out everything else. So, and I think he wrote things to add to that and subtract. In other words, he didn't just, do as I do, which I don't really put anything other than these audibles. But in his case, he actually, wrote poetry. These are really fantastic. What inspired me about his writing is the imagery.
Mm-hmm.
So when he's speaking these texts, I mean, your mind is like trying to picture every one of these things that he's talking about. The way that these images all of a sudden begin to kind of interact with each other is incredible. So what begins to happen is that all of a sudden you start really appreciating each image for what they are, and begin to notice their qualities that are not easily noticeable if you're thinking about, what you're seeing, and then all of a sudden, oh, okay, that's a house, and then you let go. But when you look closely, it's not just a house. It's a house that had this and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And you can do a whole story about this, this image that you had in your head, right? And he managed to evoke that with a simple 2-3 words. So I sort of feel like what happens in these audible sequences or sound melodies is that by placing a contrasting event after another, sometimes there's a collaboration between memory and the experience and the instant that and the next instant that's coming, and all this stuff begins to build a very complex set of relationships where you start noticing, differences in space between one sound and the other, differences in timbre, differences in frequency, in amplitude, in content, in acoustical personality, all these things that I describe being encoded in one sound. All of a sudden, it's like you break the egg and everything that's inside starts sparkling, and so listening becomes, I think, at least for me, exciting and very informative. So at the end of this, I don't know what I heard, for the most part, but I feel like I understand something, that's, and that's my goal with these pieces.
The accordion, a free reed instrument.
This piece, 85 Audible Moments, is available on the website stilllisteningoliveras.com with all scores. Actually, Gustavo's score and composition is one among 85 that are scheduled and that were prepared for Paulina Oliveira's birthday. Even it didn't happen, we all feel that actually we celebrated that moment of checking and listening these pieces, thanks to Ione, who organized everything. By the way, Ione and I had the correspondence 5 years ago.
Oh, cool.
When I prepared my paper to present in Wrocław, Poland, at one international student conference. I contacted her to get the permission to use Paulina's photos, and she was so generous. She replied immediately, and she provided me all photos to put in the book.
Yeah, I know.
If she's listening to this show now, we really appreciate it a lot of that she did for this community and for this specific event.
Yes.
Let's touch upon the last piece, Coincidence.
Okay.
That's about resonance and architecture.
Yes.
That was created for the exhibition New York, Miami 2010. That is the work you do with architecture. You combine sound and architecture. We actually discussed the piece before the show. I asked you a couple of things where actually the elevator was located that you did.
Yeah.
Tell me something more about it, and we can hear the piece after your story.
Sure. So when I was invited to do a piece for this exhibition, somehow the curator immediately brought me to this space, which is the space right in front of the elevator. It's already not necessarily typically part of the exhibition space, but it's a part of the building that he thought, well, at least it's kind of protected. It's like a little room where I could do a sound piece and not necessarily feel like resemblance of intimacy. So I was grateful because, it became a perfect space for me, but I'm not sure it was for the same reason. Because the piece ended up being, a little bit loud, not physically loud, but because of the way it resonated in other places. There was a couple of issues. Anyway, so basically you walk into a room that's about maybe 11 by 11. There's no door as you walk in, and what you see in front of you is the elevator doors. And it's a freight elevator, so it's a big elevator. And the way the piece was organized is that there were closets on the sides, and I was able to replace the doors for doors that didn't have any, weren't wooden doors anymore, but hollow. We covered them with fabric and all that. So I hid the speakers, about 4 channels of speakers in there. And then what I do is I use that system in order to organize a way to do an acoustical test of the what I seek to do with these pieces is learn the architecture of that space, but from the acoustical perspective. So, and the easiest way to do that I learned from Russell Freling is to create feedback, basically. So feedback represents kind of like the frequencies that are more likely to be amplified within that space. That already gives you a sense of the acoustical characteristics of the space. I just make notes about these resonances and stuff. And then what I do is create pieces that respond to those conditions. And then when I create that part of the piece and I bring it to that architecture and play it in the space, the experience of those sounds is almost like a revelation of that acoustical signature. So if I were to place those same sounds in a different acoustical space, the experience is much different, less resonant perhaps, et cetera, et cetera. So, I have to tune these pieces to that space, and that makes it so that every time I might do a piece like this, that's the one place where it can be shown. You can't really, if I try to do it in another space, I have to make a new piece, a new set of tones and this and that. I mean, the curator asked me to think about a way to connect my piece to some kind of geographical place in Miami. So because we chose the elevator bay, I thought, well, why not bring sounds from Biscayne Bay into the elevator bay? So the sounds of Biscayne Bay that I had, when you throw a hydrophone in the water in Biscayne Bay, the first thing you hear is shrimp. And this I don't know if you heard shrimp before, but the sound that shrimp make when they're underwater is actually, they snap their paws very, very strongly. And they do that in order to stun prey. There are little things swimming around and they can swim as fast. So they do this pra, pra, pra. But by coincidence, these sounds are similar to the sounds that they make when they're in the frying pan. So it's the same kind of like the oil kind of, that crackling noise is similar. So that's why the piece is called Coincidence. And what I did was I brought the sound of shrimp into the bed of frequencies. And I did that by means of what's called hypersonic sound. Hypersonic sound is a way of projecting sound similar to, when you have a video projector, right? A video projector projects an image onto a wall, but you don't see the image until it hits the wall, right? What you see instead, if you look at the projector from the side, is kind of like a beam of light. But, it's hard to tell what it is. But then you look at the wall, oh, I see, it's a projector. I see, right. So the hypersonic speaker projects sound in a similar way. And then when the sound hits the surface, that you can actually hear it. You could hear it if I aim the speaker right at you, right at your ear. But then, you hear just a little bit. And then if I keep moving it, you don't hear it anymore. It's like a very directional little beam of sound.
Right.
So what I did was I projected the sound of shrimp onto the doors of the elevator. So when people would push the button, the doors would open and then the shrimp will go inside the elevator. And then the sounds of the bay kind of stayed on the bay, but it's almost like fishing, And then when the doors close, the piece would disappear or something. The experience would be kind of like, there would be like a fade out kind of thing, as you would. So those are the kinds of ideas that I introduce into my sound installations. I don't make them purely about the resonances, except for a few times that I've done that. But I often try to incorporate some sound. And now I've been thinking about maybe making pieces where I transpose these resonances maybe to real instruments, right? And then, like have a piece called Elevator. Mm-hmm. And then have it played in a concert. It's just basically people playing these resonances in a space they don't belong in, and see what happens. Somehow, it sounds like a nice idea, but I haven't gotten the courage to do it yet.
have you ever combined those recordings that you made with field recorder with the acoustic instruments, real acoustic instruments?
Yes. As a matter of fact, during the pandemic, one of the things I started doing, and the 85 audible moments is one of three segments that I chose to do this with.
Mm-hmm.
I've been composing piano parts for that piece, and then there's another one for another piece that I call Seagulls, which is a recording of seagulls, and so now it has a piano bar to go with it.
Nice.
And then the last one is called Laughter, and it's basically a segment of a project that I did that was a portrait of Little Havana, where I recorded, the voices of people in Little Havana, and so there are three totally different soundtracks, sound spaces, sound in content and in space and all that, and character. And so what strings them together is the piano. I think they would be terribly hard to play. I mean, these chords are, I can't, they're very rhythmically extraordinarily complex, because the complexity of the sound gestures,
right.
They're not like in 4/4 or something like that. But I am working with someone that's helping me edit the scores, and she's doing, she's really been fantastic. Maybe after the festival, I finish that project, and then I'll be kind of, sending it to pianist friends, see if this is actually a possible project to do. But that would be interesting. I'd be really interested to hear that. It's not, again, it's like coming back to the days where I used to write the score and the electronic part, and people had to do exactly that. So I'm not sure how I feel about it after all this, but it's, it's a way to revisit all that stuff and see what happens.
Actually, that is the transposition from one medium that is recording medium, digital medium, into the space of acoustic instruments.
Yeah, exactly.
Such as piano.
Yeah, really nice.
So, Gustavo, who is Gustavo Matamoros when he's not a sound artist?
Good question. Well, look, to be honest with you, I don't necessarily play that much sound in the house. Once in a while, I do, but that's because I haven't taken the proper time to kind of tune my sound system so that I like when the music is coming out. But when the World Cup comes, everything stops.
Amazing. Unfortunately, we came to the end of today's show. You have been listening to the conversation with Miami-based composer, event and festival organizer, and educator Gustavo Matamoros, a person without whom Miami's musical life and its experimental art and sound scene would be much more reduced and neglected. Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you so much for having such a big passion for experimental art and sound, and for taking care of the Miami underground cultural scene for so many years. Also, thank you for being with us today.
And to you for inviting me, and I wish you great success with this project, and this is a great way to do it. Thank you very much.
I'm sure my listeners enjoyed this conversation and got much broader sense of the Subtropics Festival and music scene in Miami. For more information about the festival and Gustavo's work and his streaming channels, check all links in the description. To find more about Soundologia and to hear more about our guests and listen to previous shows, please visit us at soundologia.com. Also, do not forget to like our Facebook page and follow us on Instagram. I'm your host, Pedja Kovačević, and if you have any comments or recommendations, do not hesitate to write to us. Have a great day and see you in 2 weeks.